The story opens on a battlefield covered in snow, ruin, and countless dead soldiers. Years of war have reduced the land to silence, broken weapons, and frozen corpses. In the middle of the destruction stands Archimonde, barely alive. Blood pours from his mouth while a fatal wound tears through his chest. Unable to stand properly, he supports himself with his weapon as each breath grows weaker. Around him, the Knights of the Order celebrate their victory. They declare that the feared necromancer known as the Devil of the Continent has finally fallen. Covered in blood and pierced by arrows, Archimonde realizes there is no longer any path to escape. He accepts that his life will end there on the frozen battlefield. This confrontation marks the final chapter of the 10-year Continental War. An elite enemy force had managed to break through his army's defenses. Although Archimonde had prepared for such an attack, every precaution failed in the end. Looking at the battlefield, he can only admit that he has been defeated. One man stands at the center of that victory. Berkel Rhineland, commander of the Northern forces, slowly approaches through the snow. He tells Archimonde that the victory was not achieved through his own strength alone. Countless soldiers sacrificed themselves to reach this moment, and many others fought bravely to protect the front lines. Because of their efforts, he asks Archimonde to surrender and allow the continent to finally find peace. Those words only fuel Archimonde's anger. He curses at Berkel and demands silence. Furious, he asks where the knights had been when the plague was destroying entire nations. To him, the Order has no right to speak about peace after allowing so many people to die. He views them as hypocrites, pretending to be righteous after everything has already been lost. Hatred fills his eyes as dark green magic begins to surge from his wounded body. Even while standing at death's door, he still possesses terrifying magical power. Archimonde declares that he will destroy humanity with his own hands. The surrounding soldiers recoil in fear at the sight. Berkel immediately raises his shield and warns everyone to stay alert, realizing how dangerous the situation has become. The war itself began after a deadly plague wiped out nearly 20 million people. Their corpses were later turned into an army of the undead, plunging the continent into chaos. Spitting blood onto the snow, Archimonde mocks Berkel's sense of justice. He claims the attack against him is not truly about peace, but revenge. Many of the dead once belonged to the knights themselves, and he believes they simply want someone to blame for their suffering. He stares directly at Berkel and asks if he is wrong. Berkel grips his sword tightly before answering. He says he never fought for revenge. Every battle he faced was for the sake of future generations and the children who would inherit the world after them. For the first time, Archimonde hesitates at the response. Berkel continues, explaining that people must pass down their beliefs, hopes, and choices to those who come after them. As Archimonde listens, he looks toward the knight's blade and sees a reflection of himself staring back at him. But the image reflected in Berkel's eyes was completely different. He did not see a monster standing before him. Instead, he saw someone who had once walked a path similar to his own. At that moment, a brilliant light broke through the dark sky and spread across the battlefield. Covered in that holy radiance, Berkel calmly repeated that everything he had done was for the sake of the generations that would come after them. Archimonde's body finally reached its limit. The last of his strength faded, and he dropped to his knees in the snow. Knowing there was no escape left, he quietly told Berkel to finish it. The surrounding soldiers immediately became alarmed when Berkel suddenly tossed aside the holy sword. They begged him not to abandon such a sacred weapon at the final moment of victory. Berkel ignored them. Instead, he drew another blade, a dark sword covered in strange runic markings. Holding it firmly, he stepped toward the defeated necromancer and raised the weapon to his neck. He asked if Archimonde had any final words. Despite the blood pouring from his wounds, Archimonde gave a faint smile. He warned Berkel that necromancers were not so easy to erase from the world. Someday, he claimed, he would return again. Before he could continue, Berkel swung the sword. The strike was fast and merciless. Archimonde's head separated from his body in a single blow, and dark blood scattered across the white snow. At once, the soldiers erupted into celebration, raising their weapons and shouting in triumph over the death of the continent's most feared enemy. Even as his consciousness faded, Archimonde could still hear the distant cheers echoing across the battlefield. For the army, the nightmare was finally over. That battle would later be remembered as the final turning point of the 10-year war, the moment the continent defeated its greatest threat. With Archimonde's death, an era of destruction came to an end, and the world prepared to enter a new age. Far away from the frozen battlefield, rain continued to pour heavily through the darkness of the night. Thunder roared across the night sky as lightning illuminated the enormous mansion of a noble household standing in the middle of the storm. Inside one of the brightly lit rooms, two maids suddenly froze in shock while looking at a newborn child. One of them carefully stepped closer after noticing the baby's lips moving. A moment later, she cried out in surprise. Within the infant's body, Archimonde regained consciousness. Confused and unable to understand what had happened, he struggled to process his surroundings. One of the servants quickly brought over a mirror and pointed toward the elegant woman nearby, explaining that she was his mother, the Duchess. Trapped inside the weak body of a newborn, Archimonde, now called Clay, could barely move his tiny limbs. The Duchess smiled gently and encouraged him to speak. Using all the strength he could gather, the baby tried to force words out of his throat. The maids watched in amazement, shocked that a newborn appeared to be attempting speech so early. Then Clay's eyes suddenly widened. In a loud cry, he attempted to call for his dark servants and declared himself to be Archimonde. Despite being trapped in a child's body, he spoke with the pride and authority of a ruler, demanding obedience from everyone around him. The maids panicked and nearly dropped everything they were holding. At the same time, blue lightning flashed violently across the sky above the estate, making it seem as though the storm itself had reacted to the rebirth of the former Necromancer. Rain and thunder continued to rage over the mansion grounds, while lightning illuminated the large fountain outside. 15 years passed after that strange night. On a bright day in the city, several young women admired a handsome silver-haired nobleman walking through the streets. His appearance was so flawless that many viewed him as almost unreal. That young man was Clay. Despite the constant praise and attention, Clay himself looked completely uninterested. He walked with a calm but tired expression, clearly annoyed by the endless admiration surrounding him. Nearby maids whispered among themselves about how elegant and refined he looked. Suddenly, Clay sensed movement nearby and turned his head. Without warning, a bucket of water was thrown directly at him. The attacker proudly shouted that he had finally found his target. The man responsible was Garrison Bjorkman, a priest who immediately began yelling for evil spirits to leave the young master's body. Garrison frowned in frustration and insisted that the expression on Clay's face reminded him of the infamous Dark Lord from the past. The nearby maids screamed and hurried away in panic, while the priest proudly declared that his purification ritual had arrived just in time. With the bucket still covering his head, Clay pulled it off and shook the water from his hair in annoyance. He asked Garrison if he ever grew tired of repeating the same pointless ritual. The old priest ignored the complaint completely. He remained convinced that the soul of the ancient necromancer was still hidden inside the young master. Splashing more holy water toward Clay, Garrison insisted that the expression on his face moments earlier had been identical to that of the infamous Dark Lord. Clay stared at him with disbelief and questioned whether the priest had finally lost his sanity. Not wanting to deal with him any longer, Clay immediately turned and ran down the hallway while shouting insults behind him. Garrison pointed after him at once, ordering the nearby guards to stop the runaway noble. The priest loudly declared that disrespect toward the church deserved punishment, and threatened Clay with another humiliating holy cleansing. Clay shouted his own protests while trying to escape the madness surrounding him. As he ran, memories from his childhood resurfaced in his mind. After losing his life in the previous war, he had awakened in the body of a newborn child. But because he accidentally recited dark magic too early, people became convinced that he was possessed. As a result, much of his childhood was spent trapped inside a monastery. Those years became a nightmare. Young Clay often sat alone in dark rooms, isolated from everyone else. The most terrifying figure in his memories was always Priest Garrison, who constantly stood over him carrying religious books and suspicious expressions. The priest repeatedly questioned whether the person before him was truly a noble child or the reborn necromancer. His treatments were relentless. Clay was forced to endure endless prayer chants that lasted through entire days without rest. He was dragged into freezing baths filled with holy water and ridiculous purification ingredients. Sometimes he was even tied down for bizarre rituals, surrounded by sacred flames. No matter how loudly he protested, nobody ever came to help him. 5 years after surviving those experiences, Clay sat in his bedroom during a small birthday celebration, wearing a ridiculous party hat. His maid Erin smiled warmly and prayed for him to grow into a great and healthy descendant of heroes. Hearing the overly dramatic blessing, Clay looked mentally exhausted. Finally losing patience, he ripped the hat off and threw it onto the floor. Erin immediately looked heartbroken and explained that the hat had been handmade. Feeling slightly guilty, Clay bent down to pick it up and apologized for reacting so harshly. Then Erin quietly added one more detail. Priest Garrison had personally spent an entire week sewing it. Clay instantly froze, staring at the hat in complete disgust. At that exact moment, Garrison himself appeared at the doorway and emotionally called out to the young master. Touched by what he misunderstood as appreciation, the priest proudly said he was glad Clay accepted the handmade gift. Clay's expression darkened immediately. Crushing the hat tightly in his hands, he declared that he would never wear it again under any circumstances. Garrison instantly shouted that the evil spirit inside him had awakened once more, while Clay yelled back that he simply wanted to live peacefully. Before the argument could continue, the commander of the night guard entered the room and politely asked whether the ritual was finally over. With an awkward smile, he commented that rumors about the young master being possessed had continued for over 10 years already. Completely fed up, Clay grabbed Garrison's cheeks and pulled them in frustration, while complaining that even the church itself had already confirmed there was nothing wrong with him anymore. Completely ignoring Clay's complaints, Garrison casually pushed him onto the floor before greeting the commander with perfect manners. The two men continued their conversation calmly, acting as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Meanwhile, Clay remained on the ground, once again realizing how naturally the priest could hide his insanity in front of others. After finishing the conversation, Garrison announced that he would be leaving. His polite behavior made it obvious that he fully understood how to act properly when necessary. However, just before stepping through the doorway, he glanced sideways at Clay with a sharp and suspicious expression. The atmosphere instantly became heavier. Garrison quietly explained that he could never completely lower his guard, because there was always the possibility that something dangerous still existed inside the young master. After delivering that unsettling warning, he suddenly stopped as though he had remembered something important. Then, with ridiculous enthusiasm, he raised his arms above his head and formed a heart shape while reminding Clay about the next purification ritual. Clay immediately told him to get out. Even so, he quickly waved him away impatiently, wanting the priest gone as fast as possible. Once Garrison finally disappeared and only the servants remained, Clay grabbed his hair in frustration and collapsed into a nearby chair. He muttered angrily about how absurd it was that someone officially recognized as a healer could torture people so openly. Aaron nodded in agreement and admitted that the old priest looked more like some kind of giant demon than a holy man. Then, with innocent curiosity, she carefully asked whether Clay truly was not the villain everyone feared. Holding a towel to dry himself, Clay forced out an awkward laugh and denied it immediately. In truth, he simply could not bear hearing the name of his former self anymore. Deep down, he knew that admitting the truth would only make his situation far worse. Behind him, memories of his old identity lingered like a shadow that refused to disappear. Clay thought back on the years he had spent trapped, monitored, and treated like a dangerous creature. Although he constantly complained about Garrison's obsession, he also understood that the priest held terrifying authority within the church. Curious about something else, Aaron stepped closer and asked what the title Exarch actually meant. Before Clay could respond, Commander Dunley explained that the title belonged only to the strongest individual within the entire church. At the far end of the hallway, Garrison's overwhelming presence alone made that explanation believable. Dunley added that very few people in the world could stand against someone like him. According to him, perhaps only the head of the duchy would truly be capable of dealing with the priest directly. Aaron looked impressed and praised the strength of the noble family. Clay answered casually, as though the idea were obvious. While gently fixing his hair, Aaron then asked which duke in the family's history had been the strongest. Clay rested his cheek against one hand and thought briefly before giving a confident answer. In his opinion, the first head of the family had been unmatched. Dunley attempted to argue that the current patriarch also deserved recognition, but Clay interrupted him before he could continue. With complete confidence, Clay stated that no one could surpass the family's founder. His tone was so serious that Dunley found himself unable to argue further and simply stayed quiet. Aaron smiled brightly after hearing that and mentioned that the answer made sense. According to her, Clay had always seemed fascinated by the first duke because he spent so much time staring at the founder's portrait. Hearing that, Clay silently thought to himself that what he felt was nothing close to admiration. Dunley gave a faint smile and commented on how much time had passed since the family was first established. Clay slowly turned his attention toward the portrait hanging on the wall. Looking at it filled him with a strange heaviness. 2 centuries of history separated that man from the present. The noble bloodline had continued from the first duke all the way to the current 7th generation. At the top of that long family history stood the image of a famous warrior from the past, the legendary knight Berkel Rhineland. Clay quietly accepted the cruel truth once again. In his previous life, he had been Archimonde, the feared necromancer defeated by that very man. Now he had been reborn as Berkel Rhineland's descendant. The irony felt unbearable. Even after all this time, the memory of his death continued to haunt him. In his nightmares, he repeatedly relived the final moments of the war. He remembered glaring at Berkel with hatred while standing in the snow-covered battlefield. He remembered the knight's calm response before delivering the final strike. Berkel had declared that everything he fought for was meant to protect the future generation. Then the sword came down. Once again, Archimonde saw his severed head rolling through the frozen battlefield. Clay suddenly woke in the middle of the night, breathing heavily as the nightmare faded. Sitting upright in his large bed, he tried to calm the panic still lingering in his chest. Sweat covered his face as he muttered curses under his breath and reminded himself of his current identity. At the same time, he could not deny that the hatred and madness which once consumed him belonged to the past now. 200 years had passed since the day he died in the snow and opened his eyes in a completely different era. As he climbed out of bed, he grumbled quietly about still not being used to his pale silver hair. Then, from somewhere nearby, Garrison's deep voice suddenly broke the silence. The priest calmly remarked that Clay had been saying some very suspicious things in his sleep. Garrison gave Clay a suspicious smile, and sarcastically asked whether he had been dreaming about the life of the infamous Necromancer again. His unhealthy obsession with the subject was obvious, as always. Wanting to avoid trouble, Clay quickly tried to change the situation by pushing Aaron forward and casually claiming that he had simply been exhausted lately. Unfortunately, Aaron only made things worse. Clearly upset, she crossed her arms and insisted that she had heard everything during the night. According to her, Clay had been talking in his sleep and even muttering about killing everyone. Clay immediately shouted at her to stop talking nonsense and demanded to know when he had supposedly said anything like that. Before the argument could continue, Butler Berkman entered the room and calmly mentioned the upcoming sword demonstration. He also thanked Aaron for informing them about Clay's strange sleep talking. The moment Clay imagined Garrison hearing all of this, a feeling of dread hit him instantly. As expected, the butler announced that the priest had decided to double the young master's purification sessions. Panicking, Clay hurriedly covered Aaron's mouth before she could accidentally reveal anything else. Internally, he cursed Garrison repeatedly and complained about the priest's endless torment. Later, while walking through the mansion corridors, Clay finally asked what the sword demonstration was supposed to be. Berkman, walking slightly ahead, explained that the Duke had personally ordered Clay to attend this time. Aaron happily walked beside them while enjoying a sweet snack, completely unaware of Clay's growing confusion. He could not understand why his father suddenly wanted him present for an event he had never cared about before. Berkman glanced back at Aaron while chewing on something himself and casually asked if the maid was causing trouble again. Clay simply shook his head and commented that she looked unusually happy today. Eventually, they entered a large and luxurious hall filled with nobles. Clay immediately found the situation strange. The Duke had never summoned him to gatherings like this in the past. Berkman calmly explained the reason. Several members of the branch families had come to visit the estate. Hearing that, Clay lowered his head slightly in annoyance. Distant relatives were exactly the kind of people he disliked dealing with. As expected, multiple nobles across the hall stared at him with mocking expressions. Clay instantly understood that this gathering would become exhausting very quickly. One noble joked that they should stop calling him Clay and instead refer to him as Lord Archimonde. Others laughed while bringing up the years he spent isolated inside the monastery. Clay recognized many of them as cousins from his father's side of the family. Some overweight boys stuffing themselves with food appeared to belong to the northern branch. Elsewhere, a group of Western relatives quietly whispered among themselves while watching him from afar. Among them sat a blonde girl lounging arrogantly in one of the chairs. Several relatives assumed Clay could not hear their insults as they quietly called him the disgrace of the Rhineland family. Irritated by their behavior, Clay glanced coldly over his shoulder and silently mocked the idea of family unity. In the end, he decided their names were not even worth remembering. To him, these relatives only acted so boldly because the power of the duchy itself had begun to weaken. The way the branch families openly mocked a direct heir of the main bloodline revealed just how unstable the duchy's authority had become. In the middle of the grand hall, the long-awaited sword demonstration was already underway. Two young swordsmen clashed repeatedly, their blades striking with sharp metallic sounds across the training ground. One of them, a purple-haired boy, stumbled backward after taking a hit. Clearly irritated, he shouted at his opponent and demanded that he stop holding back during the match. Despite the pressure, the blonde swordsman blocked every attack with little effort. The frustrated challenger insisted he could still continue, though his confidence was beginning to crack. The blonde calmly smiled and questioned whether that was truly the case, especially considering how the family treated him as one of its greatest hopes. The young prodigy standing there was Delon, Clay's half-brother. Watching from a distance, Clay quietly admitted to himself that most of the family's reputation as master swordsmen survived because of Delon's talent alone. Driven by pride, the purple-haired youth charged forward again with everything he had, determined to win this time. At that moment, Clay's eyes faintly glowed purple as he focused completely on the duel. Since his reincarnation, This was the first real sword fight he had carefully observed. Every movement immediately caught his attention. Delan moved smoothly across the floor, avoiding the reckless attack with clean and efficient footwork. In the same instant, he shifted his balance and prepared a counterattack with incredible speed. A yellow aura wrapped around his body as he launched himself upward. The sudden movement completely caught his opponent off guard. Clay narrowed his eyes. To his surprise, he could clearly follow everything happening before him. He noticed every small detail, the positioning of Delan's feet, the transfer of momentum, even the precise way mana flowed through his body during the attack. The purple-haired boy barely had time to react before Delan's sword descended. Clay immediately recognized the technique being used. It was one of the secret sword arts passed down through the Rhineland family. With overwhelming force, Delan unleashed the meteor sword technique and slammed his opponent violently into the floor. The duel ended instantly as the defeated youth collapsed in the center of the magic circle beneath them. Standing over him, Delan calmly reminded him that he had already warned who would lose from the start. Around the hall, nobles erupted into admiration. Many praised Delan's skill, while others were shocked that someone his age could perform such an advanced family technique so flawlessly in public. Clay quietly scratched his cheek as he watched the reactions around him. It became obvious to him that the entire demonstration had been arranged to remind the branch families that the main house still possessed overwhelming strength. Even after the duel ended, Clay could not stop thinking about what he had seen during the fight. The strange clarity with which he observed Delan's movements continued bothering him. Before he could think further, a cheerful voice called out to him from across the hall. Delan approached with a relaxed smile and asked when Clay had arrived. Clay answered casually that he had only just entered the room. Still smiling, Delan joked that he would have made the fight more impressive if he had known his younger brother was watching. Clay looked at him silently and admitted to himself that Delan was annoyingly talented in almost everything. At the same time, he continued wondering why the branch families had gathered there in the first place. In his mind, the most likely explanation was simple. They had probably come to pressure the duchy for money again. A deep voice suddenly interrupted his thoughts. The family patriarch stepped forward and praised Delan's performance in front of everyone present. It was Duke Henkel, the current head of the Rhineland family. With calm dignity, the Duke congratulated Delan for mastering one of the family's secret techniques. Delan respectfully bowed his head in response. Clay quietly observed the man who now stood as the leader of the family he had unwillingly joined after reincarnation. Henkel openly acknowledged Delan's hard work and talent, clearly proud of him. Watching the interaction, Clay concluded that Delan was likely the Duke's greatest remaining source of hope. Nearby, Commander Dunley also praised Delan, complimenting the precision and natural skill displayed during the duel. Embarrassed by so much attention, Delan humbly replied that he still had much to learn. The Duke then recalled the words left behind by the family's founder. According to him, the Knights of House Rhineland were meant to stand above all others in the Empire. Placing a hand on Delan's shoulder, Henkel told him to remember those words and continue advancing with confidence. A moment later, the Duke shifted his attention toward Clay. Unexpectedly called forward, Clay quietly waited without saying anything. Henkel slowly reached out and gently placed a hand on his head. However, sadness crossed the Duke's face as he admitted that he still could not sense any mana within him. Clay lowered his eyes and apologized softly. Inside, however, he bitterly understood the truth. To the family, he was little more than a disappointment with no future expectations placed upon him. Commander Dunless stepped in and accepted responsibility, explaining that Clay had lost many important years of training while confined inside the monastery. Almost immediately, whispers spread among the visiting relatives. Many were shocked that the Duke's second son possessed no magical talent, while his older brother was considered a genius. Some quietly concluded that the main family line was weakening, creating an opportunity for the branch families to gain influence. Ignoring the whispers, Clay quietly walked away. He repeatedly told himself that their opinions meant nothing to him. But then Berkel Rhineland's words suddenly resurfaced in his mind. The founder had once declared that he fought for the future of the children. Hearing the nobles laugh behind him filled Clay with frustration. His fist tightened as anger rose inside him. In that moment, he could not understand why Berkel had sacrificed everything to protect people like them. In Clay's eyes, the Rhineland family had already begun to decay from within. As he prepared to leave the hall, Delan called out to him one last time and offered a polite farewell. Clay acknowledged it briefly before continuing toward the corridor. However, before he could leave peacefully, the young noble who had lost the duel stepped in front of him and blocked his path. The boy wore a bitter expression as he mocked Clay openly. He sneered at the idea of someone belonging to the main bloodline despite being unable to properly use either magic or swordsmanship. According to him, Clay acted far too proud for someone with no talent. Clay remained calm and showed no visible anger. Instead, he quietly looked at the noble and asked whether secretly chasing women around the estate was supposed to be something impressive. The insult immediately irritated the other boy. With an angry expression, he accused Clay of trying to cover up rumors with money and called him a shameless fool. At that moment, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor. A stern voice suddenly demanded to know where such disrespectful nonsense was coming from. Before the noble could react, Commander Dunley grabbed him and slammed him onto the floor effortlessly. Humiliated and furious, the relative lashed out recklessly and shouted that Clay was trash who did not even know who his real mother was. The atmosphere instantly changed. Clay fell completely silent. Slowly, he turned his head and stared back at the noble with a cold and dangerous expression. In a low voice, he asked him to repeat what he had just said. The arrogant relative immediately froze. For the first time, genuine fear appeared on his face as he felt the oppressive pressure coming from Clay. Deep down, Clay knew his anger had little to do with the subject of his mother herself. What truly disgusted him was the arrogance and corruption spreading through the branch families. Looking at the frightened noble on the floor, Clay wondered how a once great bloodline had fallen into such pathetic behavior. The thought reminded him of his final battle in his previous life. Even now, he struggled to understand how the descendants of Berkel Rhineland, the man powerful enough to defeat him, could have become so weak and disgraceful. Meanwhile, Dunley released the defeated noble and sternly declared that the situation had gone too far. Standing firmly between them, he warned that disrespect toward the direct heir of the main family would no longer be tolerated. Unable to fight back, the humiliated relative could only grit his teeth and accept the scolding before leaving angrily. As the boy retreated, Dunley coldly remarked that he should consider himself fortunate someone had intervened. A moment later, the commander suddenly stiffened. He noticed Clay slowly reaching toward the hilt of a nearby sword. Clay's eyes remained fixed on the shining blade with unusual intensity, as though he had already made some kind of decision in his mind. Clay suddenly caught Dunley's attention and casually asked whether the commander had a spare sword he could borrow. Later that night, the estate became quiet as darkness covered the training grounds. Under the dim night sky, Dunley handed Clay a practice sword while wondering why the young master suddenly wanted one. Curiosity was obvious on his face, though he chose not to question him directly. Standing alone in the empty field, Clay slowly tested the sword's balance and weight. As he moved the blade through the air, he quietly recalled the duel from earlier, especially the moment Delon used the meteor sword technique. After a moment, Clay turned toward Dunley and asked him a few questions about the technique itself. Then he stepped into a combat stance. Calmly, he warned the commander that he wanted to confirm something and requested that Dunley attack him first. Watching from nearby, Dunley grew thoughtful. Part of him realized that the youngest son had never truly abandoned swordsmanship. Even so, the realization brought him disappointment, more than hope. In his eyes, it was already too late. Without mana, Clay could never officially become a knight. More importantly, the meteor sword was considered one of the Rhineland family's secret arts, a technique created by the Duke himself. Dunley believed it should have been impossible to copy after seeing it only once. Meanwhile, Clay slowly closed his eyes. The duel replayed perfectly inside his mind. Every detail remained unbelievably clear to him. Delan's posture, the movement of his feet, the timing of his breathing, and the exact flow of strength traveling through his body during the attack. The deeper Clay focused, the sharper his understanding became. It felt as if his body itself had memorized not only the movements, but also the mana control hidden behind them. When he finally opened his eyes again, a faint purple glow appeared within them. At the same moment, Dunley suddenly sensed a heavy pressure filling the training ground. Alarmed, he quickly turned around. The atmosphere had completely changed. A terrifying force spread outward from Clay's direction, powerful enough to make even an experienced knight instinctively tense up. Dunley's eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at the young master. Then Clay moved. In a single explosive motion, he perfectly recreated the Rhineland family's secret technique. Purple energy erupted from his blade as a massive slash tore across the training field with overwhelming force. Dark mana surged around him while the attack ripped through the ground ahead. Clay remained standing calmly as the destructive wave shattered nearby rocks and sent debris flying into the air. Smoke and dust spread across the field. Dunley could only stare in complete shock. Unable to understand what he had just witnessed, the commander struggled to believe that someone considered talentless had managed to reproduce such an impossible technique. Clay looked satisfied after testing the technique, though inwardly he was surprised that his improvised version had worked even better than he expected. Later that day, Erin stood nearby with a confused expression, unable to understand the bizarre scene unfolding in front of her. Priest Garrison was once again carrying out one of his harsh purification rituals, though this time he looked genuinely unsettled. He stared into the bubbling water container in disbelief, shocked by how long Clay had remained underwater. After counting the time, the old priest suddenly became excited and loudly announced that the young master had managed to hold his breath for over a minute. A moment later, Clay finally pulled himself out of the water, coughing heavily while struggling to breathe. Furious and exhausted, he demanded to know whether the priest intended to perform the next ritual inside a giant aquarium. While Clay complained about the constant torment, Garrison only laughed and insisted that he had sensed dangerous energy coming from him again. Clay angrily asked whether he was expected to suffer every time the priest had a strange feeling. Before the argument could continue, Commander Dunley entered the room carrying a letter. His serious expression immediately drew attention. Still drying his soaked hair, Clay asked who had sent the message. Dunley explained that it came from the cousin Clay had embarrassed the previous day. Clay instantly became suspicious. He found it hard to believe that someone like Dalton would suddenly behave politely. Carefully reading the invitation, he quickly realized it was for a hunting competition. The proposal immediately felt suspicious and completely unlike Dalton's normal behavior. After thinking it over, Clay concluded that the invitation was probably just an excuse to lure him outside the mansion. Dunley asked whether he still intended to go. Clay calmly answered that he saw no reason to refuse. Deep down, however, he viewed the situation as a useful opportunity. Since discovering his new ability, he had spent hours repeatedly analyzing Delon's meteor sword technique in his mind. By replaying every detail countless times, he arrived at an unbelievable realization. He could perfectly imitate any skill after seeing it only once. Dunley silently understood that Clay wanted to test this newfound power. Although concerned about the danger, he chose not to argue further and instead agreed to prepare the carriage for the journey. Just then, Garrison suddenly appeared and casually announced that he would accompany them as well. Clay was immediately irritated by the priest's constant interference. Garrison simply reminded him of the warning he had given earlier, repeating once again that he sensed suspicious energy around him. During the trip westward, the priest continued repeating the same explanation, while the carriage violently shook along the rough road. Annoyed by the constant bouncing, Clay remarked that this was exactly why he had tried to stop Garrison from joining them in the first place. Trying to ease the situation, he handed the priest a cushion and explained that the western roads were especially rough for anyone unfamiliar with traveling there. Clay suggested that the nausea might improve if Garrison rested with his eyes closed for a while. The priest nearly became emotional, believing the young master was finally showing concern for him. However, Clay instantly ruined the moment by telling him to hand the cushion to Aaron instead. Eventually, the noise inside the carriage settled down. Leaning against the window, Clay quietly watched the passing scenery outside while lost in thought. As the carriage continued through the countryside, Clay quietly stared out the window at the calm scenery passing by. The peaceful land made him think about how much the region had changed over the centuries. In his memories from the past, these same fields had once been frozen beneath endless snow and littered with corpses after brutal battles. Now, the land was alive again, filled with signs of prosperity and peace. While thinking about that transformation, Clay reluctantly admitted to himself that such a future only existed because of Berkel's sacrifice long ago. Eventually, the carriage came to a halt. Dunla opened the door and informed Clay that they had arrived. Stepping outside, Clay immediately saw the enormous estate belonging to the Cornwell branch family. The mansion was extravagant and far more luxurious than he expected. He found it ridiculous that a branch family possessed a residence even more excessive than the main household. To him, it looked like they were wasting enormous wealth on meaningless appearances, especially for something as trivial as a hunting event. Before he could continue thinking about it, a familiar voice interrupted him. Dalton approached while holding two hunting dogs by their chains. Wearing an arrogant smile, he asked what Clay found so interesting about the estate. He proudly bragged that the mansion had been built using wealth squeezed out of the main family. Mocking Clay's upbringing, Dalton claimed that someone who spent years trapped inside a monastery could never understand how the real world worked. Clay ignored the provocation entirely. Instead, he noticed how thin and mistreated the hunting dogs looked. Rather than arguing, he simply asked when the hunting competition was supposed to begin. Dalton laughed and said he had expected Clay to grow impatient quickly. Claiming he had prepared everything in advance, he snapped his fingers and ordered everyone to watch carefully. At the signal, the starving dogs immediately sprinted toward the forest, officially beginning the hunt. Dalton calmly explained that he had scattered bloody bait throughout the mountain region to lure wild animals toward the area. He boasted that hungry hunting dogs possessed senses far sharper than ordinary humans. Lifting his crossbow, he proudly explained his cruel method. As soon as animals chased the scent of blood, he simply shot them while they ran. Moments later, an arrow flew through the trees and struck one of the running dogs directly. The wounded beast cried out in pain while the others were targeted just as mercilessly. Dalton burst into laughter while watching the brutal scene unfold, openly enjoying his own twisted hunting game. Aaron reacted in shock at the pointless cruelty and instinctively called out to Clay. That immediately caught Dalton's attention. Smiling maliciously, he approached Aaron and casually placed a hand on her head. He mocked her for constantly following Clay around and suggestively told her to come with him instead, promising her a better kind of treatment. Before he could continue, Clay suddenly grabbed Dalton's wrist tightly. The movement instantly stopped him. With an icy expression, Clay ordered him to remove his hand from his maid. His grip tightened further as he warned that he would break Dalton's arm if he touched her again. Startled by the threatening tone, Dalton quickly pulled away and forced out an irritated laugh. As he walked toward his horse, he muttered complaints about Clay acting arrogant despite his weak position within the family. Not wanting to waste more time arguing, Dalton mounted his horse and prepared to head deeper into the forest. From atop the saddle, he mockingly told Clay to follow him, adding that wandering alone in the forest could be dangerous. Clay mounted his own horse shortly afterward. Before leaving, he instructed Dunla to stay behind and protect Aaron until he returned from the suspicious trip into the woods. Dunla remained uneasy about letting Clay head into the forest alone. Before the young master departed, the commander handed him a special magic scroll. He explained that the item was a disposable emergency artifact. The moment it was torn apart, it would immediately send a distress signal. Clay understood why Dunlay could not simply follow him into the forest. If his personal guard disappeared alongside him, it would only make the situation appear suspicious to everyone watching. Raising his right hand, Clay showed the magical crest engraved on it and calmly instructed Dunla to use the scroll without hesitation if something went wrong. Trusting the knight to act when necessary, Clay rode his horse into the forest and disappeared among the trees, leaving Dunlay and Aaron behind at the mansion. From the courtyard, Priest Garrison silently watched the young lord depart. Unlike usual, the old priest wore an unusually serious expression and said nothing. Hours passed. The evening sky slowly darkened until the mountain forest was covered beneath cold starlight. Clay continued riding through the narrow trails while carefully following the visible tracks ahead of him. Judging by the signs on the ground, he estimated that Dalton could not be far away anymore. Suddenly, he pulled on the reins. A familiar voice echoed through the darkness, confirming his suspicion. Dalton sat casually atop the corpse of a dead animal, while holding his sword across his lap. Smiling arrogantly, he mocked Clay for arriving so late. Clay calmly stepped off his horse and stared at his relative without emotion. He asked what kind of pathetic scheme Dalton had prepared this time. At the same moment, Clay unsheathed his own sword, already expecting an ambush hidden nearby. The area around them was filled with carcasses scattered across the forest floor, evidence of Dalton's cruel hunt. Without showing the slightest guilt, Dalton spread his arms and declared that this bloody scene was the final attraction of the competition. Then his expression twisted with madness as he pointed his weapon directly at Clay and announced that the true prey tonight would be him. Clay repeated the threat in disbelief. Dalton laughed and swore that he would personally cut off Clay's head and throw it before Delon. Hearing such stupidity only disgusted Clay further. In his eyes, the once great family had fallen into complete ruin. The bloodline that had once carried honor now looked weak, rotten, and pathetic. Moments later, armed men stepped out from the shadows of the forest. The ambush was finally revealed. Dalton confidently declared that Clay would not even have time to react before being killed. The mercenaries surrounding the clearing grinned viciously, while archers positioned themselves on nearby rocks with bows aimed directly at him. One of the killers mockingly told Clay to curse his worthless bloodline before dying. Clay slowly looked around the clearing, calmly studying every detail of the trap. Then, in a cold voice, he admitted that the bloodline truly had become worthless. The mercenary leader laughed arrogantly and claimed that by the next morning, the entire continent would mock the downfall of the once famous House of Swordsmen. He even joked about spreading rumors that the young heir had been reduced to dog food inside the forest. At those words, Clay suddenly remembered Berkel. The legendary hero's final words echoed in his mind, his determination to protect the future of the next generation. The irony of the current situation became so absurd that Clay could no longer contain himself. At first, a quiet laugh escaped his lips. Then the former Dark Lord covered part of his face with one hand and burst into loud laughter that echoed through the silent woods. Dalton stared at him in confusion and demanded to know whether fear had finally driven him insane. Clay slowly wiped the tear from his eye before lowering his hand. Part of his face remained hidden beneath the darkness while his eyes glowed with a frightening red light. In a cold, dangerous voice, He called Dalton an arrogant brat who had forgotten his place. The atmosphere instantly changed. A terrifying pressure spread across the clearing so suddenly that Dalton's confidence shattered almost immediately. Sweat formed on his face as fear replaced the arrogance in his expression. Clay looked at the men surrounding him with pure disgust, and questioned how people like them dared to disgrace a lineage that had once been built through sacrifice and bloodshed. Dark energy began swirling violently around Clay's small body, spreading across the clearing like black smoke. The sudden pressure made Dalton step back in fear. Shaking nervously, he stared at Clay in disbelief, and demanded to know how someone without mana could possibly use spells. Clay looked at him coldly, and corrected him. He warned Dalton that what he was witnessing was not magic at all. Surrounded by deep shadows, the former Necromancer spoke in a chilling voice, and revealed that the power flowing around him was pure demonic energy. The mercenaries immediately became uneasy. Fear spread through the group as they questioned what kind of monster Clay truly was. Dalton finally began to understand the meaning behind Clay's words, and the realization destroyed what remained of his confidence. A frightening smile spread across Clay's face while eerie green flames flickered around him. Drawing power from the depths of his soul, he called upon ancient spirits that had long vanished from the world. Using his true authority as the former Dark Lord, he commanded the dead to rise once more and obey him. Dark flames burst across the forest floor. One after another, skeletal creatures began emerging from the shadows. Black skulls rose from the cursed fire while twisted undead soldiers gathered behind their master. Clay calmly ordered them to devour every enemy standing before him. The number of creatures continued growing as the forest filled with the sound of rattling bones and unnatural movement. The summoned beings radiated murderous intent and surrounded the mercenaries from every direction. Dalton's entire body trembled violently. He refused to accept that the ancient legend of the Dark Necromancer could possibly be real. Then, as the skeletal army fully revealed itself behind Clay, terror overtook him completely. In panic, he shouted the feared title once associated with the legendary Dark Lord. Clay slowly extended one hand forward with a cruel smile. At his command, the undead army charged into the clearing. The massacre began instantly. As screams echoed through the forest and bones clashed against steel, Clay quietly realized that the violent instincts from his previous life had never truly disappeared. For a moment, it felt as though the last 2 centuries had vanished completely. The voices of the dead once again called out to him from the darkness, and the familiar sensation awakened memories he thought had long faded away. Standing in the middle of the bloodshed, Clay covered part of his face and almost enjoyed the terrible nostalgia returning to him. Nearby, Dalton stared at the horrifying scene while drenched in cold sweat. One terrified mercenary screamed the old Dark Lord's name after witnessing the army of black skeletons rise from the ground. Without denying it, Clay calmly admitted that people once knew him by exactly that title. The mercenaries froze in fear. At last they understood that the rumors surrounding Clay had not simply been childish nonsense. The summoned skeletons looked completely unnatural. Their bones were pitch black, while deep red light glowed from their hollow eyes. One of the undead quietly muttered a single command: kill. Dalton stood speechless as the overwhelming difference in power became painfully obvious. Trying to calm himself, one mercenary forced out a nervous laugh and claimed the creatures were still nothing more than piles of bones. Clay's expression darkened immediately after hearing the insult directed toward his army. Desperate to recover his confidence, Dalton loudly claimed that he had destroyed countless skeletons during previous battles. Still, he could not stop himself from questioning why these monsters looked different from ordinary undead. Ignoring every warning his instincts were giving him, he arrogantly declared that they would take one of the black skeletons home as a trophy. Then he angrily ordered his men to kill the undead creatures blocking their path. The archers immediately pulled back their bowstrings and aimed toward the undead army. Nearby, the mercenary leader ordered the long-range unit to prepare a rapid attack, while the crossbowmen hurried to load their heavy weapons. Without wasting another second, the commander gave the order to fire. A storm of arrows shot through the dark forest, rushing straight toward Clay. The deadly volley was fast enough to kill an ordinary target instantly. Clay remained completely calm as he watched the attack approach, his glowing eyes fixed on every projectile. The arrows crashed into the muddy ground around him, but none of them struck their intended target. Dalton's face lit up with excitement for a brief moment, believing Clay had been torn apart by the barrage. However, his smile disappeared almost immediately. A defensive wall had appeared in front of Clay. The black skeletons had thrown themselves forward and used their own bodies as shields, blocking every arrow and bolt aimed at their master. Watching the flawless formation, Clay coldly realized that 200 years had been more than enough for the world to forget how terrifying his army truly was. The mercenaries stared in disbelief at the undead defenders. They had mistaken the creatures for ordinary skeletons. Clay calmly made it clear that his summons were far beyond simple undead monsters. Dalton froze where he stood as Clay quietly told him to keep watching carefully. At once, Clay gave another order. The front line of skeletons broke formation and charged. Berkel's final words echoed once more in Clay's mind. The hero's belief that Clay had to die for the future of the North. Remembering that sacrifice only fueled his anger further. Clenching his fists tightly, Clay swore that he would crush the filth mocking that legacy. The undead soldiers surged forward at terrifying speed. Dalton's eyes widened in panic as he watched the skeletons sprint across the battlefield. He shouted in disbelief, unable to understand how creatures like them could even move that quickly. The forest was swallowed by a wave of black undead rushing toward the mercenaries. One frightened soldier tried to calm the others and shouted for everyone to maintain formation. Before he could finish speaking, a skeleton sliced across his chest with brutal force. Blood erupted from his mouth as he collapsed. The undead army tore through the defensive line mercilessly, turning the battlefield into chaos within seconds. Dalton cursed desperately while watching his trained men die far too easily. With no better option remaining, he ordered the second line of crossbowmen to surround the skeletons and slow their advance. The mercenaries quickly looked upward, only to discover another threat already waiting for them above. Several skeletons stood hidden among the high tree branches while carrying massive weapons resembling small ballistas. One terrified mercenary screamed that the monsters possessed ranged weapons and ordered everyone to run. Clay's face remained emotionless. Quietly, he gave the command to fire. Heavy bolts immediately tore through the air and rained down upon the fleeing soldiers. The projectiles pierced through their backs with horrifying force. Screams echoed through the forest as men collapsed one after another onto the blood-soaked ground. The impact from the giant bolts sent even surviving mercenaries crashing into the mud. Dalton trembled while watching the slaughter unfold. At last, he fully understood how dangerous these creatures really were. Fearful that his entire force would be wiped out, he screamed for the survivors to abandon their bows and fight the skeletons directly. Desperately trying to regain control, he cursed at his remaining men and demanded to know why they were standing around uselessly. Then he suddenly noticed movement behind him. A skeleton was approaching silently through the darkness. Enraged, Dalton charged toward it while swinging his heavy sword. Finding an opening, he cut cleanly through the creature's neck and sent its skull flying across the grass. Dalton laughed loudly, convinced he had finally discovered the monster's weakness. But the skeleton did not fall. Its body remained standing even without a head. Dalton's laughter stopped instantly. Fear spread across his face as the headless undead calmly bent down, picked up its own skull, and placed it back onto its neck. The red glow inside its eyes burned brighter than before. Clay watched the scene without emotion, and reminded Dalton that he had already warned him his servants were different from ordinary undead. In Clay's mind, the explanation was simple. Spirits created through demonic energy could not be destroyed by normal physical attacks. The restored skeleton released a monstrous roar before charging back into battle. Nearby, terrified mercenaries began retreating as the undead army displayed coordinated tactics far beyond mindless monsters. The battlefield slowly transformed into complete despair. The skeletal soldiers cornered the remaining enemies from every direction, proving exactly why Archimonde had once ruled the continent through fear. Even so, Clay quietly noted one limitation. His current body was still too weak to fully support the overwhelming power he once possessed. At most, he could currently maintain only 11 undead units at once. Still standing calmly amid the massacre, Clay looked toward Dalton and coldly asked whether the hunt should continue. At the main mansion, the marble fountain shimmered quietly beneath the moonlight while the distant sounds of conversation filled the courtyard. Priest Garrison sat with Aaron, laughing loudly as he shared embarrassing and ridiculous stories about Clay's days at the monastery. Aaron listened with sparkling eyes, clearly enjoying every word. Smiling warmly, Garrison teased her by saying she seemed deeply attached to the young master. Without any hesitation, Aaron happily admitted that she liked Clay very much. Meanwhile, deep inside the forest, the atmosphere was completely different. One of the surviving mercenaries dropped to his knees and begged Clay to stop the slaughter. The terrified man trembled as he spoke, calling the young lord a monster beyond imagination. Before he could continue, a black skeleton pierced straight through his chest. Blood spilled across the ground as the man collapsed lifelessly. At the same time, Aaron's innocent voice echoed in contrast within Clay's thoughts. She remembered the cookies he had given her and proudly declared that Clay was the kindest person she knew. But in the middle of the battlefield, Clay stood surrounded by blood and death. Without emotion, he raised his hand once more and commanded the skeletal army forward. The dark summons obeyed instantly. tearing through the remaining mercenaries without mercy. Dalton struggled desperately against one of the monsters. He barely managed to block a brutal attack before swinging his sword with all his strength to knock the creature away. Yet the black skeleton recovered immediately, as though the blow meant nothing. Breathing heavily, Dalton cursed the monsters and tried to understand how to destroy them. Then his eyes locked onto Clay standing calmly in the distance. At that moment, he realized the undead existed because of their summoner. If Clay died, the creatures would disappear as well. Grabbing onto that idea, Dalton charged forward wildly with his sword raised high. He shouted that this ridiculous game with corpses would end now. Believing victory was finally within reach, he swung his blade directly toward Clay's neck. However, Clay remained perfectly still. A strange purple glow appeared within his eyes as he calmly observed every movement Dalton made. Time itself almost seemed slower to him. Dark energy wrapped around his sword while the memory of Delon demonstrating the Rhineland family technique resurfaced clearly in his mind. Clay copied the stance flawlessly after seeing it only once before. Dalton's face twisted in shock the moment he recognized the famous sword style. Then Clay moved. In a single blinding motion, he unleashed the meteor sword technique. A massive slash of destructive energy exploded forward and struck Dalton directly before he could defend himself. Dark flames flickered around Clay's hand while a terrifying aura spread through the forest. Dalton stared at him in disbelief and demanded to know how someone without mana could use such power. Clay answered in a cold voice that this was not ordinary magic at all. What surrounded him was demonic energy born from darkness itself. Dalton's legs finally gave out, and he crashed onto the blood-soaked ground. The battle was over. Clay lowered his sword slowly and admitted that Dalton's assumption had been right all along. Once the summoner died, the creatures connected to him also lost their power. It was the same weakness that had once led to Archimonde's downfall in the past. But to Clay, the situation felt strangely ironic. The terrifying lord who once depended only on demonic power had now been reborn inside the body of a noble heir. Instead of weakening him, the Rhineland blood flowing through his veins had made him even stronger than before. Holding his blade tightly, Clay quietly declared that he could no longer ignore the problems of this family. Since fate had forced him into this body, the burden of the house had become his responsibility as well. Meanwhile, Dalton twisted painfully on the grass, barely able to breathe. Confused and terrified, he demanded to know what Clay was talking about. But Clay completely ignored him. His cold eyes stared deep into the darkness ahead as he calmly told Berkel to keep watching. Then, while looking at the ruined state of the family, Clay made a silent promise to himself. No matter what it took, he would rebuild the collapsing Rhineland house with his own hands. Sometime later, Dalton slowly regained consciousness. Pain shot through his entire body as he opened his eyes, only to find endless darkness surrounding him. There was no light, no sound, and no sign of escape. Panic immediately crept into his chest. The moment he tried to move, chains rattled violently. Cold iron wrapped around his wrists, arms, and legs, locking him tightly to a horrifying metal chair. Fear spread across his face as he realized he couldn't move at all. Then suddenly, a dim red glow flickered through the darkness. The light revealed Clay standing silently in front of him. His expression carried no warmth, no mercy. With the terrifying aura of Archimonde surrounding him, Clay calmly explained that this was the realm where souls ended up after death. Dalton froze in shock. His lips trembled as he asked if this was truly the cursed afterlife created by the Necromancer himself. Clay simply confirmed it. Then, without emotion, he began listing Dalton's sins one after another. The innocent animals he tortured, the brutal killings he disguised as hunting games, the countless lives destroyed for his own entertainment. Even chained down, Dalton exploded in anger and screamed for Clay to stop talking nonsense and release him immediately. But then the memories returned. The battle, the attack, the fatal strike that pierced him before he could even react. His face slowly turned pale. He should have died. Dalton stared down at his own body in horror, unable to understand how he was still conscious after receiving a deadly wound. Sweat poured down his face as panic completely consumed him. This is impossible. Without reacting, Clay raised a small blue flame above his palm. Then the darkness around them began to move. Low growls echoed through the void as massive hellhounds stepped forward one by one. Their glowing eyes locked onto Dalton like hungry predators staring at prey. Clay spoke in a calm but chilling voice. The time had finally come for Dalton to pay for everything he had done. The monstrous beasts revealed rows of razor-sharp fangs, and terror completely shattered Dalton's remaining pride. It almost looked as if the souls of his victims had taken shape inside those creatures, turning his punishment into a reflection of his own cruelty. Desperate, Dalton pulled violently against the chains, but the chair never moved. Then the hounds attacked. Their jaws tore into him mercilessly while horrifying screams echoed throughout the darkness. Dalton cried, begged, and screamed for help as he experienced the same suffering he had inflicted on others for years. Blood-like tears streamed down his face while endless pain swallowed him whole. Clay watched everything silently. Then he coldly told him that this hell had been created by his own actions. Back in the real world, Clay stood alone in the middle of the ruined forest. The undead skeletons remained behind him in complete silence, waiting for his command. After a long pause, Clay turned toward them as cyan-colored energy wrapped around his body. He quietly thanked them for their help. Then he broke the curse binding their souls. A soft blue light drifted into the night sky as the skeletons slowly disappeared one after another. The entire forest glowed peacefully while their freed souls scattered into the wind like fireflies. Watching them ascend, Clay reflected on what true death really meant. Not fear, not suffering, just bones returning to dust beneath the endless sky. But his thoughts soon shifted toward the mercenaries lying dead in the mud nearby. Once again, the same question haunted his mind. Why had he been brought back to life? Suddenly, a voice echoed from the darkness. It congratulated him. Clay's eyes sharpened instantly. He turned around and raised his guard without hesitation. Whoever had spoken had clearly witnessed everything. From beneath a torn hood, a sinister man revealed a twisted smile while eerie green magic gathered around his hand. The stranger calmly stated that his name was meaningless. Even if he explained himself, Clay supposedly wouldn't understand anyway. At that exact moment, one of the corpses nearby suddenly twitched. Dark energy wrapped around the dead mercenary before the body slowly rose back to its feet. Its eyes glowed unnaturally, revealing the truth immediately. Another necromancer was standing on the mountain. Soon more corpses began crawling out from the mud under the hooded man's control. Rotting zombies staggered forward, surrounding the battlefield once again. The mercenary leader finally realized what they were dealing with. Relieved, he laughed cruelly and declared that the dead bodies scattered across the mountain would still be useful after all. His sadistic laughter echoed through the forest as another deadly confrontation began. Far away at the main mansion, Aaron excitedly approached Commander Dunley, hoping to hear stories about Clay's childhood. But Dunley barely reacted. His attention remained fixed on the emergency signaling scroll in his hand. A heavy feeling settled inside his chest. 3 full hours had already passed since the hunt began, and Clay should have returned by now. Unable to ignore his instincts any longer, Dunley finally decided to head toward the forest himself. But before he could leave, a local guard blocked his path. The man warned him not to abandon his position and suggested waiting until the hunting event officially ended. Dunley stared at him silently. Then his eyes noticed the crest engraved on the guard's armor. Cornwell family. At that moment, everything became clear. Dalton's personal soldiers had been involved from the start. A dangerous aura slowly spread from Dunley's body as he reminded them that protecting the main heir was his duty above all else. If anyone tried stopping him again, he would not stay silent. The guard immediately swallowed nervously, unable to answer. Aaron sensed something was wrong and asked anxiously what had happened. Dunley quickly ordered her to return to the mansion with the priest, but Aaron hesitated before explaining that the priest had already disappeared earlier without saying a single word, wearing a strange expression on his face. Dunley's eyes widened. He suddenly remembered Garrison mentioning a sinister presence earlier that day. Now the priest's disappearance no longer felt like a coincidence. Realizing the danger, Dunley cursed under his breath before jumping onto his horse. The moment the horse charged forward at full speed, one terrifying thought filled his mind. Clay had walked directly into a trap. Meanwhile, deep inside the western forest, Clay struggled to catch his breath. The previous battle had drained nearly all of his demonic energy. His necromancy was no longer usable, and his fragile body felt painfully heavy. He clicked his tongue in frustration, realizing this weak body could not survive a prolonged fight. The mercenary leader noticed his exhaustion immediately. With a vicious grin, he pointed toward Clay and shouted for everyone to attack before the young master could recover. The killers rushed forward together, their weapons gleaming beneath the dark forest sky. The hooded man began preparing another spell while mocking Clay for trying to oppose him with dark magic. A cruel smile spread across his face as the moon-shaped crest on his arm suddenly released a powerful glow. The moment the spell activated, the ground around the battlefield shook violently. Armed zombies burst out from the shadows and rushed toward Clay with terrifying speed. Their rusted weapons gleamed under the moonlight as they closed in from every direction. Clay's eyes narrowed. With his demonic energy almost completely exhausted, escape was becoming impossible. Seeing this, the mercenary leader laughed confidently and declared that the young heir's life was finally over. But the next second, everything changed. A massive flash of golden light exploded across the night sky. Before anyone could react, a gigantic pillar of holy energy descended from above and slammed directly into the battlefield. The impact shook the entire forest and instantly erased the undead creatures charging toward Clay. A deafening explosion echoed through the mountains. When the smoke cleared, a towering figure stood in the middle of the destruction. Priest Garrison had arrived. Golden light surrounded his body, while holy energy surged wildly around him. His blazing eyes stared at the undead monsters with overwhelming fury as he called upon divine power to grant peace to the restless dead. Another wave of sacred energy burst outward from his body and swept through the forest like a storm. Every evil creature caught in its path disappeared instantly without leaving behind even ashes. The mercenary leader froze in terror. His voice trembled as he asked what kind of monster had appeared before them. Garrison slowly turned toward him with a cold expression and introduced himself as an exarch of the Holy Order. Then he warned them that the real battle was only beginning. The title of exarch belonged to only 3 individuals within the church. They were living weapons personally chosen to carry out the Pope's will. Each one possessed enough destructive power to rival an entire fortress army alone. As violent winds spread from the priest's holy aura, the mercenary leader covered his face in fear. At the same time, more beams of divine light rained down from the heavens and crushed the remaining undead summons one after another. The thug gritted his teeth and nervously asked which of the 3 legendary exarchs Garrison actually was. Clay silently observed the priest's stance and quickly realized the truth. The old man standing before him was the exarch, famous for overwhelming physical strength and close combat ability. Completely confident, Garrison calmly told Clay that everything was under control, now that he had arrived. Before anyone could speak further, one of the surviving undead creatures lunged toward the priest with a savage roar, but Garrison disappeared instantly. In the blink of an eye, he appeared directly in front of the creature and drove a devastating punch into its skull. The zombie's head exploded apart immediately, scattering broken bones across the battlefield. Without slowing down, the priest swung another massive punch into a crowd of enemies, while shouting for the sinners to repent. Holy light burned brightly within his eyes, as he demanded that the wicked seek forgiveness through prayer. Then Garrison grabbed another enemy by the throat and smashed him violently into the ground. The impact cracked the earth beneath them as the priest promised to deliver a true baptism of fire. The surviving mercenaries panicked and tried to run away. Unfortunately for them, Garrison chased them down effortlessly. Every step he took shook the muddy battlefield while divine energy exploded from his attacks. He declared that he would personally cleanse the sins of this worthless trash, before slamming his foot into the ground and unleashing another terrifying barrage of punches. Several enemies were blown apart instantly. To Garrison, this brutal destruction was simply another form of mercy. Watching the massacre unfold, the mercenary leader broke into a cold sweat. He couldn't understand why an exarch had appeared in such a remote place. The gap in strength between his men and the priest was beyond hopeless. Realizing defeat was unavoidable, he turned around and fled while cursing the people who hired him. This insane situation had clearly not been part of the original agreement. As he desperately tried escaping, he angrily complained that such overwhelming brute force was completely unfair. Then suddenly, a massive shadow appeared behind him. Garrison calmly asked where he thought he was going. The mercenary barely had time to scream before the priest grabbed his head with one enormous hand. Agony spread across the man's face as Garrison slowly tightened his grip. Ignoring the desperate cries for mercy, the priest coldly stated that today's prayers were not finished yet. Little by little, the mercenary's skull began to crack under the crushing pressure. Garrison told the sinner to feel honored for receiving divine judgment personally. A moment later, what remained of the mercenary's equipment rolled across the muddy ground, signaling the complete end of the battle. Clay watched the horrifying scene silently. Even he found himself shaken after witnessing the priest destroy an entire army using nothing but raw physical strength and holy power. For the first time since his reincarnation, Clay genuinely felt intimidated by another person's presence. More than 20 enemies had been annihilated within seconds. Soon, Garrison stepped out from the darkness and extended a blood-covered hand toward Clay. Despite the battlefield being drenched in blood, the priest's expression remained strangely calm. He explained that he rushed there immediately after sensing the aura of necromancy nearby. Then his eyes slowly scanned the battlefield. After studying the lingering dark energy in the area, Garrison quietly admitted that something about the situation felt unusual. The evil aura he sensed earlier did not seem to belong to the mercenary leader at all. The moment Clay heard those words, cold sweat ran down his back. Inside his mind, he cursed the overly sharp priest. His injured body already felt close to collapsing, and he understood clearly that making even a single suspicious move right now could get him killed instantly. Before the tension could grow further, another voice suddenly echoed through the forest. Commander Dunley finally arrived on horseback, anxiously calling out for the young heir. Surprised, Clay could only quietly say the commander's name. Blood dripped down the side of his face while intense pain spread through his body. The heavy use of forbidden magic had pushed this fragile body far beyond its limits. The moment Dunley saw Clay's terrible condition clearly, horror filled his eyes. Without hesitation, he jumped off his horse and rushed toward him through the dark battlefield. Clay's exhausted body finally reached its limit. His vision blurred, and his legs suddenly gave out beneath him. Before he could collapse onto the bloody ground, Commander Dunley rushed forward and caught him in his arms. The commander's face filled with horror as he looked around at the destroyed battlefield covered in corpses. He immediately asked what had happened there. His eyes quickly searched for Dalton among the bodies, but Clay quietly turned his gaze away instead of answering right away. Under the pale moonlight, the young heir finally spoke in a cold voice. He admitted that he had killed Dalton himself. The next day, the entire matter was brought before a gathering of nobles inside a massive conference hall. Standing calmly in the center of the chamber, Clay explained that he only acted in self-defense after Dalton attempted to murder him first. The moment those words left his mouth, a furious slam echoed across the room. Count de Lulkin, leader of the Cornwell family, struck the table with rage burning in his eyes. He shouted that Clay had no right to accuse his dead son of such a crime. According to him, Dalton had been a loyal and honorable man, and blaming him after death was disgraceful. The tense atmosphere immediately spread across the hall. One noble tried calming the situation and suggested that everyone should focus on uncovering the real cause behind the tragedy instead of arguing emotionally. However, another lord with long dark hair raised several documents and pointed out something important. After many hours of questioning, Clay's testimony had remained perfectly consistent the entire time. Not only that, records also showed that nearly 20 mercenaries connected to de Lulkin had disappeared during the same night as the incident. The color drained slightly from de Lulkin's face. Inside his mind, he cursed the idiots who had failed to erase the evidence properly. Still, another noble interrupted and argued that the story sounded impossible. Clay had supposedly never even trained with a sword before. Everyone in the hall knew the boy possessed no mana or combat talent. Several others agreed immediately, recalling that Patriarch Henkel himself once confirmed Clay's weakness publicly. Watching the discussion spiral out of control, de Lulkin realized he was in serious danger. If the ambush became exposed, his entire family would suffer. Desperate to redirect suspicion, he suddenly lowered his voice and brought up rumors surrounding Clay's mother. He even mentioned the boy's strange claim from childhood about being connected to dark magic and necromancy. The long-haired noble immediately warned de Lulkin to stop spreading nonsense during an official gathering, but by then, the furious Count had already lost control. He directly accused Clay of secretly hiring killers and using the situation to frame Dalton after murdering him. Before he could continue shouting, another voice suddenly cut through the room sharply. Everyone turned in surprise. Clay calmly stepped forward into the center of the hall. His eyes carried no fear anymore. He stated coldly that he had listened to enough lies already and refused to tolerate any more false accusations. Once again, he repeated that he only defended himself from an assassination attempt. He also reminded everyone that Priest Garrison personally witnessed the aftermath in the forest. Cornered by the statement, de Lulkin desperately called him a shameless liar. Clay responded immediately by throwing the accusation back at him with a calm smile. Inside his mind, he almost found the entire situation amusing. If people wanted to believe absurd rumors so badly, then perhaps the stories claiming he was the reincarnation of the Dark Lord were true as well. De Lulkin gritted his teeth furiously while Clay silently remembered the promise he made after killing Dalton. No matter what happened, he would protect this family from the parasites destroying it from within. Suddenly, loud knocking echoed through the giant doors of the meeting hall. The heavy doors slowly opened. A confident female voice apologized for arriving late. The moment she entered, the atmosphere inside the room completely changed. Leia, commander of the Order of the Holy Spirit, walked into the hall with elegant steps and an overwhelming presence that immediately drew everyone's attention. From the corner of his eye, Clay watched her carefully. Her appearance felt unexpected. During his previous years of training, she had never shown any interest in him before. He couldn't understand why she suddenly decided to involve herself now. Some nobles quietly complained that the matter had nothing to do with her family or authority. However, Patriarch Henkel calmly explained that he personally allowed her participation. That Dalton previously carried out missions under Leia's cavalry division. Because of that professional connection, she held the right to participate in the investigation. After hearing the explanation, Leia slowly scanned the hall with sharp eyes. Then she walked directly toward Clay. Stopping in front of him, she stared at him silently for several seconds, before asking permission to speak with him privately. Some nobles questioned the request immediately, but Hankel accepted it as long as the conversation remained short. He ordered Clay to accompany her without delay. A small bead of sweat rolled down Clay's face. As they walked through the luxurious hallway together, Clay silently complained in his mind about how troublesome noble warriors always were. Still, he quickly realized this situation might actually become useful. He guessed that Leia either wanted to confirm the truth, test his reactions, or personally investigate the suspicions surrounding the murders. At the same time, he suspected his father was also using this opportunity to judge him indirectly. Because of that, Clay decided not to act timidly. Instead, ambition slowly rose inside him. If possible, he intended to use Leia's influence and connections for his own future plans. Finally, he opened the door to a private meeting room. Leia entered first with graceful but firm steps. The moment Clay stepped inside behind her, she suddenly turned toward him and moved closer without warning. Then, using an unexpectedly playful tone, she completely caught him off guard. Before Clay could react, Leia cornered him against the closed door and softly asked if she could touch him. Clay's face instantly turned red in confusion. For a moment, he genuinely wondered whether this absurd situation was actually real. Leia was not just another noblewoman. She was the eldest daughter of a powerful house and one of the Empire's greatest spearmasters. Official battle reports described her as terrifyingly ruthless, despite her elegant appearance. On the battlefield, she wielded her spear with monstrous skill, releasing devastating slashes capable of tearing apart entire groups of enemies at once. Massive creatures barely had time to roar before being cut down by her overwhelming speed and precision. Dozens of high-ranking monsters had already died at her hands, without leaving even a scratch on her armor. Throughout the Empire, her strength had practically become legendary. Back in the present, Clay nervously tried stepping away and asked what exactly she thought she was doing. Leia ignored the complaint completely. Instead, she leaned even closer and reminded him not to misunderstand their distant family connection as genuine closeness. Hearing that, Clay suddenly remembered his father once mentioning that Leia technically shared some distant relation with their house. Still, after thinking carefully, he realized they did not actually share the same direct bloodline. Leia's cheeks grew slightly red as she quietly admitted that her interest now came purely from personal curiosity. Then, without warning, she shoved the platinum-haired boy against the wall. Clay let out a startled sound, while Leia stared down at him like a predator cornering helpless prey. Once again, she repeated that she wanted to touch him. At that point, even Clay's normally calm mind began falling into complete confusion. Outside the room, his frustrated voice echoed loudly as he demanded to know where this madness had suddenly come from. Ignoring the complaint, Leia firmly grabbed his wrist and ordered him to show her his hand. Clay immediately panicked internally. Leia carefully examined his palm and fingers with intense focus. She pointed out that his skin remained far too soft and smooth for someone who supposedly fought with swords regularly. There were no scars, no calluses, no signs of training. While rubbing her thumb across his hand in a disturbingly invasive way, she calmly explained that tendons and muscles never lied about weapon experience. His body clearly lacked the marks of a swordsman. Still confused, Clay asked where exactly she was going with this investigation. Leia then asked the real question directly. Did he truly defeat trained knights and 20 mercenaries using only swordsmanship? Or had he survived by relying on some other mysterious power? Realizing the trap hidden inside her words, Clay immediately pushed her away and finally created some distance between them. After regaining his composure, he sarcastically asked whether she was also planning to accuse him of being the Dark Lord himself. At that moment, Clay fully understood how dangerous this woman truly was. Her flirting had never been genuine. She was intentionally trying to break his composure and force a careless reaction from him. Knowing silence would only make him look more suspicious, Clay chose the opposite approach and treated the entire accusation like a joke. Surprisingly, Leia suddenly burst into laughter. She repeated the title, Dark Lord, in an amused tone before mocking his appearance. According to her, there was absolutely no way someone as small and short as him could possibly be the reincarnation of such a terrifying monster. Clay froze completely. Oddly enough, that insult hit the former Dark Lord much harder than expected. Clay's face immediately darkened after hearing Leia's comments about his height. The former Dark Lord looked completely offended. With visible irritation, he asked if she had made a mistake while speaking. But instead of correcting herself, Leia casually asked whether she needed to repeat the insult more clearly. Then she attacked his pride even harder. According to her, he lacked everything necessary to resemble a terrifying ruler. His proportions were too small, his voice lacked intimidation, and his overall presence felt more like a harmless shrimp than a legendary monster. Even though Clay knew she was mocking him intentionally, the words still dealt serious damage to his pride. Leia then glanced back over her shoulder and casually added another ridiculous statement. If Clay could truly defeat an official knight one day, she would allow him to kiss her as a reward. The sudden offer completely froze his brain. After insulting him so brutally, she suddenly threw out something so absurd that he couldn't even process the conversation anymore. For several seconds, Clay could only stare at her silently while wondering what kind of twisted logic led to that reward. Part of him suspected it was simply another political trick meant to provoke him. Meanwhile, Leia calmly walked toward the door while soft afternoon sunlight poured through the nearby window. Just before leaving, her expression turned slightly serious. Quietly, almost to herself, she murmured that the real Dark Lord would never act with such restraint and self-control. Soon afterward, the two returned to the meeting hall where the judgment continued. Back inside the chamber, Clay silently admitted that he had underestimated the nobles. Expecting them to believe his words so easily had been naive. Count Dululkin still stood proudly among the assembly, fully aware that the testimony of an isolated young heir carried very little value compared to powerful branch families. Curious about their delayed return, the long-haired noble politely asked what Leia and Clay discussed privately. But before Leia could answer, a loud crash shook the entire hall. Everyone jumped in surprise as Clay suddenly slammed a sword into the marble floor with tremendous force. The thunderous sound echoed through the chamber. The nobles stared at him in complete shock. Without hesitation, Clay looked directly at Count Dululkin and declared that he would personally prove the truth with his own hands. Gripping the sword tightly, he coldly ordered the branch leader to stop wasting time. Then, before anyone could interrupt him, Clay officially challenged Dululkin to a trial by combat. The room instantly exploded into chaos. Several nobles questioned whether the young heir had completely lost his mind. Trial by combat was an ancient northern tradition with almost no restrictions. Weapons, magic, and deadly techniques were all permitted. In the end, only the victor decided the truth. Even Dululkin looked stunned by the sudden proposal. Struggling to understand the boy's confidence, he asked why Clay would choose such a dangerous method. Clay answered calmly. Dululkin ignored clear evidence of the assassination attempt, and even insulted his mother publicly in front of the entire hall. Deep down, however, Clay himself felt little emotional attachment toward the woman who gave birth to this body. Still, he understood that allowing such disrespect openly would weaken his position within the family. Under pressure from everyone watching, Dululkin tried telling the boy to calm down, but Clay immediately pushed him harder. He asked whether the Count planned to keep the entire noble gathering waiting because he was afraid to answer. The branch leader suddenly found himself cornered. Then Patriarch Hankel stepped forward and openly supported Clay's proposal. He announced that the duel's outcome would be officially recognized by the entire lineage. Hearing that, Dululkin quickly began calculating the situation in his head. If he accepted the duel and won, all suspicion surrounding the ambush could disappear completely. Realizing the opportunity before him, the Count slowly regained his confidence. With a mocking smile, he questioned whether a weak magic boy could truly carry such a burden. Then he announced that he would appoint a knight to fight in his place. Inside his mind, Dululkin swore that this time Clay would die for good. But Clay's expression remained cold. He warned that the only person destined to die in that arena would be the opponent, and through that death, everyone would finally understand exactly how Dalton himself had fallen. At last, Dululkin formally accepted the challenge. The duel would take place 4 days later. Leia silently observed the entire exchange without interfering. Meanwhile, Clay quietly renewed his determination. This duel would become the perfect opportunity to force the Branch family back into their proper place. Night slowly descended over the enormous estate. Along with the darkness came Clay's growing vow to destroy the corruption inside the family and rebuild it from the ground up. Later that evening, inside a luxurious room illuminated by an expensive chandelier, Delan suddenly exploded in frustration. He demanded to know whether his younger brother had completely lost his sanity by proposing a trial by combat. Meanwhile, Clay sat calmly in an armchair without showing the slightest concern. He simply sighed and admitted that he already understood the risks involved. Delan clenched his fists tightly, especially after learning that even Patriarch Hankel approved the duel. With no remaining argument capable of stopping it, Delan finally offered to fight as Clay's representative instead, but Clay rejected the idea immediately. Crossing his arms, he reminded his older brother to think realistically. The survival of the main family depended entirely on keeping the true heir safe. Sending Delon into the arena would only hand victory directly to the Branch family if something went wrong. Clay understood his brother's frustration, but he insisted this was a burden he had to carry himself. Only by surviving personally could he completely clear his name. His decision never wavered. The former Dark Lord even admitted that he had no intention of wasting such a valuable opportunity. The atmosphere inside the room gradually became heavier. Then Delon quietly revealed his true feelings. He remembered the day Clay was born. Back then, when he first saw the tiny child reach out and grab his finger, Delon immediately felt an overwhelming sense of affection. To him, the newborn had looked like a little angel. That memory never disappeared from his heart. With sadness in his voice, Delon confessed that he waited 7 long years to reunite with his younger brother again, only to watch him walk directly toward death now. Clay found it strangely uncomfortable seeing his older brother cry so openly. Before the emotional atmosphere could continue, another voice suddenly called from the doorway. Commander Dunla entered the room and apologized for interrupting. Then he revealed that Count Delulkin had already selected a champion for the duel. Still listening to his brother's complaints, Clay casually asked who the opponent would be. Dunla's expression immediately became tense. He revealed the chosen fighter's name, Randall, an excommunicated warrior infamous for his brutal and bloody reputation. Elsewhere, massive iron doors slowly opened inside a dark underground chamber. The grotesque room was decorated with hunting trophies, including the stuffed head of a roaring lion mounted on the wall. A thick crimson liquid almost identical to fresh blood poured from a wooden bucket into a large iron goblet. Sitting among scattered weapons and filth, the giant mercenary radiated violent killing intent. Without a trace of refinement, Randall grabbed the entire bucket and drank directly from it like a beast. The scar-covered fighter twisted into a disturbing smile after hearing news about the upcoming duel. With horrifying excitement, Randall admitted that it had been a long time since he last enjoyed mutilating children. Far away inside the safety of the mansion, Clay quietly stared into the darkness with cold determination, waiting for the coming bloodbath.